Good morning, everyone. I hope you all have had a great weekend and have fully recovered from all the parties you have had over the weekend. So, in the last week, you have all looked at the foundational theories on peace and conflict studies. You have looked at the tools for mapping conflicts. You have looked at how to analyze conflicts using the CR-Cipabio model. You have looked at the conflict behavior theories. And one of the key take-homes from the previous week was that peace and conflict studies as a field is extremely transdisciplinary. It cannot be reduced into an isolated field of its own. There are different areas of study that feed into a better understanding of peace and conflict studies. And this is what we are going to focus on in the second week. Okay, so today we are going to begin with human rights and its linkages with conflicts and peace building, where the human rights fit into that interface. Tomorrow, our colleague Jean Breitling will be dealing with environment, natural resources, and peace and conflicts. Then you will have on Wednesday a session on gender and peace building with Professor Heather Kurtzia. And then on Thursday, you will be focusing on food security and sustainable development with Olivia Sylvester. Okay, so this week we are looking at perspectives, and in the final week, of course, as you know, you will be looking at different interventions into resolving or transforming conflicts using these different lenses. Okay, so now to begin with, I think it's very important to understand that the interface between human rights, conflicts, and peace building is quite complex. It's quite complex for many reasons, but I'll just outline 4 reasons. The first reason is that there is a significant amount of difference among opinions and ideologies of different people around the world on what human rights mean. We start from there. We might want to assume that there's a common understanding around the world on what are human rights, but that is not really the case. Different people perceive human rights differently, and I'll take you through some of those different perceptions and ideas of human rights. Secondly, there is also a big debate and complete lack of consensus, more or less, on what norms can constitute human rights. For instance, you might be surprised that is water a human right? Yes. You'll be surprised that there are many countries who officially have taken a stand that the right to water is not a human right. Okay? United States being one of the most vociferous in that. So there are many countries who do not even agree on some of the basic norms on whether they are human rights or not. So that's one other problem in this interface, in trying to understand how human rights impacts conflicts and peace building. The third problem is that different actors perceive violations of human rights differently. On the first day of your lectures with Professor Amar, he mentioned that no terrorist looks into the mirror, wakes up one day and says, I'm the bad guy. It's the same with human rights. Many different actors in a conflict on differing sides would perceive violations of human rights differently. They would perceive that they are the ones who are wronged and therefore they are in the conflict. Okay, so interpretations of violations of human rights also differ from groups to groups, persons to person. And that also complicates these issues. And that's why those conflict analysis tools are very important in identifying what the different perceptions are, what their interests are in the different groups. And finally, there's also a big difference of opinion among scholars on how to respond in a programmatic fashion or a policy fashion to violations of human rights. Should we use force for violations of human rights that may be at a grave level or gross level in a particular country? Or do we adopt less coercive mechanisms to try and generate an organic debate within a community to try and have those violations removed? So you can think of many such examples, such as criminalization of homosexuality in a given country. Or you could think of the practice of what is called as female genital mutilation. We clearly know these are violations, but the question is, how do we respond to these violations in a given community? Do we go and tell those people that you are barbarians, you torture your own people? Is that likely to work? Or is a more organic fashion of discussion within the community a solution within the community likely to work? So these are all problems that emerge in how human rights work in tandem with peace and conflict studies. So with this backdrop, let's look at the agenda for today. I have 4 points, and I'll give you many examples on each of these. The first is, of course, a theoretical discussion on the human dimension of peace. We live in a world which one could say is very anthropogenic, where human beings are the center of the universe, right? So we tend to look at different problems around the world based on the human person. And therefore, when we understand peace and conflict studies, and tomorrow you will, of course, have the different perspectives on Mother Nature, on how environment also, not the human person, should be the center of attention. But the human rights discourse is animated with the assumption that everything is about the human person. So even violations of environmental norms, such as environmental degradation, natural resources depletion in the human rights framework, is looked at from the perspective of human right to environment, not the environment itself having its own rights. Okay, so it's very anthropogenic in that sense, where human beings are the center. So we'll look at the human dimension. There are 3 related concepts here: human development, human security, and human rights. These are many times perceived by scholars, even seasoned researchers, as overlapping concepts, as synonymous concepts, but they are not. There are, of course, some overlaps, but they're different concepts, and we'll see what those are. And we'll relate this to some of the things you have studied in the first week, such as the basic needs theory. Then we'll look at the emergence of what we today call as international human rights law, which is assumed to be universal, applicable to all human beings around the world, irrespective of their own local contexts. Now, this idea that human rights are universal, applies to everyone, to all people around the world, is in fact rather new. It is only a creation of what we call as the post-World War II period. Of course, different societies around the world had their ideas and concepts of human rights, and they practiced it very much. Indigenous communities in many parts of the world had very strong notions of human rights. In Sub-Saharan Africa, Ubuntu, many of you must be familiar with this. This was a notion, this is a notion very strongly of human rights. Many would argue the Bible, the Quran, the Gita, all of these contain very strong human rights principles. What is new, however, is the universality of human rights at the global policy-making level. This is a creation of the post-World War II period. So I'll talk about how that came about, the historical epochs, the key milestones how this came about, and what is the institutional approach of the United Nations as an organization to human rights. Having said that out, I will then challenge that notion of human rights as a universal norm which is applicable to everyone in one common ideological framework. In other words, this is not to say that human rights do not apply to everyone. What I'll point out is that different people have different notions of what human rights mean, and the assumption that there is a common understanding of what human rights are probably needs to be deconstructed and unpacked. Okay? And with that, I'll then point out that these differing perspectives on human rights many times are actually the cause of conflicts in different forms. Violent conflicts, non-violent conflicts, even interpersonal conflicts at all levels. International, national, community, interpersonal. These different perspectives on human rights feed into the notions of conflicts, and to real conflicts, in fact. So let's begin with the first one. Now, I think we all can be very clear and agreeable to the fact that our ultimate quest, whichever communities we are, is to build safe societies and communities where all women and men, girls and boys, have human security, human development, and human rights. This is all what we all aspire for in all communities, and the assumption here being that once we have these, we would create the fertile ground for what we call a sustaining peace, okay, or sustainable peace. Sometimes that word is used. Now, clearly, the link between conflicts on the one hand and peace on the other hand, human rights on the other hand, is a two-way street. Conflicts clearly derail, they threaten all of these three concepts. They threaten whenever you have a conflict. Obviously, there are violations of human rights. There will be a challenge to human security and to human development. And the other way is equally true, that whenever you have a violation or undermining of human development, human security, human rights, they are then the breeding grounds for conflicts to emerge. Okay, so you can think of the basic needs concept here. The idea, the theories on basic needs, whenever there are violations of basic needs, those become the ideal circumstances for conflicts to emerge. Okay, so very similar in case of human rights. It's a two-way street. Now, I've pointed out here, I've used three terms: human security, human development, and human rights. And clearly the word that is common to all these three terms is human. I've also pointed out that these are overlapping concepts, but there are good significant differences between these. And I'll take you to what the differences are. And I think that this is something that will help you in whichever programs you are in understanding your individual theories and programmatic courses in a much better fashion. So when we look at human dimension of this, it is contrasted with the focus on the national or the sovereign. Each of these concepts, human security, human development, and human rights, emerged as a challenge to the centralization or the focus on the state, on the sovereign. Okay? So think of human development. This concept emerged as a critique of the predominant focus of development on the national. Previously, national development was measured in GDP, in how rich a country is. United States is one of the richest countries in the world because it has a massive GDP. That was the idea of national development. But what national development masks are the underlying inequities between people within groups inside a particular country. And it's for that reason that the notion of human development emerged. They said we can't focus at the national level because it doesn't really reveal the inequities, the inequalities that exist within communities. We need to focus on the human person, on the human development aspect of it. Okay? So let's look at whether the human person is developed in a country, and that would give us better indication of what responses are needed. Similarly, the idea of human security emerged as a critique of the predominant focus of security on the national. So national security is very militaristic in terms, protection of the borders. The more military power you have, the more arms and ammunition you have, you're a stronger nation. Okay? Now, human security again emerges as a critique of the notion of national security. Both human security and human development are relatively new concepts. They emerged in the period between 1989 and 1994. Okay, that was the first time these notions, these concepts were articulated. So, and think of human rights. Again, this notion, the focus on the human person, emerged as a critique of the concentration of powers in the sovereign, particularly in what we know today as international human rights law, which to a large extent is very Eurocentric. And I'll point out the reasons why I say that. To a large extent, human rights as a notion in popular discourse from a Eurocentric perspective could be traced to something like the French Declaration of the Rights of the Man. Okay, very patriarchal language there as well, rights of the man. But this declaration in, I think, 1789 was basically where the French people went up in arms against the concentration of power with the monarchs, with the state, and said, well, it's no good that we talk about sovereign rights. We need to talk about human rights, the rights of the human person. That's where the rights really should vest, not with the state. So the most important part about this slide is to understand that whether we think of human development, human security, or human rights, the key concept here is the focus not on the state, but on the human person. Okay, so you reduce it to the basic level, to the individual level. Now, what's the difference? Now, this is a very simple chart, a diagram, to explain the difference between these three terms. Now, you see a vector. 9th grade physics, everyone knows what a vector is? A vector is a line with an arrow. Okay, so that's a vector. That's a vector. So at the bottom of that is human security. So the idea of human security basically refers to all those basic threshold minimum requirements that are essential for human beings to live another day with dignity. So you can think here of it as basic needs. So what are the basic needs we need? Not just another day of life without dignity. We're talking about with dignity. So food, clothing, shelter, housing, health, freedom from want, freedom from fear. All these are very basic threshold minimum requirements that are essential for human beings to live another day with dignity. That's what we refer to as human security. As we advance from that threshold, as we improve that threshold, we are moving towards human development. But human development, as you can see, is not an end point. That's why it's a vector. We can never reach a circumstance where we can claim that we have fully achieved human development. It's a constant effort at improving from any given threshold. Okay, that's why that arrow, it's not an end. That's human development as we advance from that. Where do human rights fit into this? Human rights provide us the tools for claiming both human security and human development. Human rights provides us the language of claims and entitlements. When we talk about human rights, when we say that food, I need food, we say that I have a right to food. What I'm then saying is that I am the right holder and the state is the duty bearer. You clearly articulate who the right holders are, who the duty bearers are, because that then helps accountability. That's where human rights comes in. You don't go to a court of law and say my human security is violated. You say my right to health is violated, my right to life is violated. Okay, so that's where human rights fits in. It provides us the language of claims and entitlements, which human security and human development do not. Okay, so this is how all these three terms work in tandem. There are clear overlaps with each other, but there are also important distinctions between these terms. Why do these become important? And I'm going slightly on a tangent, but I think it's very relevant. In post-conflict societies, when we are thinking of reconstruction of societies, one of the major flaws with previous United Nations policies has been that they have adopted a one-size-fits-all template for all societies that are in reconstruction phase. So many times they would go in with a human development framework when what is actually needed on the ground in a post-conflict situation might be human security. That might be the first thing that needs to be focused on rather than going in with frameworks, with templates of human development. And there are actually different templates for human security, for human development, and things like that. Okay, so these are where the differences become very important between human security and human development. Are we all fine so far? Yeah.
Yes. Doctor, I'm not very much clear. What do we mean with the human development?
Okay, so I've pointed out that human security focuses on the very basic threshold minimum requirements, right? So we're talking here about availability of right to food or availability of healthcare at the very basic level. As you advance, as you make improvements on that, okay, when you make improvements, you're moving towards human development. So any improvement from the basic threshold of human security is what we refer to as moving towards human development. And there is no finality, there is no final point that we can say that we have reached human development. It's always a constant effort at improvement from a given threshold. So in a post-conflict society, for instance, where you might have no food, no housing, people do not have the means to live another day with dignity. It is more important to focus on those factors first rather than, let's say, holding an election by electoral ballot, right? Or focusing on other sectors, so the judicial sector. You need to prioritize your responses in a post-conflict setting. So when we talk about human security, we are trying to make sure that someone is able to live, people are able to live another day with dignity. Unless you achieve human security, you cannot achieve human development. You always have to reach the basic threshold and then move towards that. Okay? Yeah.
I just want to get an idea of what you're mentioning. Would human development include things here like
To a large extent, yes. I mean, so there would be it is a spectrum, right? So you would probably have right to education somewhere closer to human security than the than towards the arrow. In case of democratic participation, probably it might be closer to the end. And I say democratic participation in very loose terms because there's a big misunderstanding that democracy means elections. And that's not necessarily democracy. We've seen what happened in Iraq. People thought that holding elections in the post-Saddam period, just having elections by electoral ballot would lead to a democracy and everything will be hunky-dory. What happened? Daesh came about. ISIS came about, right? So notion, and it doesn't mean that democracy is inappropriate or elections are inappropriate for Iraq. It just means that the basic circumstances, the ground realities to hold elections were ignored before you jump directly to those aspects. Okay, so that's what we refer to as human security. These are the basic threshold requirements that are essential to be fulfilled first. And on Iraq, there are several studies done on precisely these points, on how elections by electoral ballot were a very US-centric view of what democracy is, was assumed to work, and it doesn't necessarily work. I mean, again, in a country like India, for instance, and my colleagues from India will vouch for this, India is known as the biggest democracy in the world, but if you go to the rural areas, people don't vote for policies of the candidates they are voting for. They vote on caste lines, they vote for a bottle of liquor, they vote for a washing machine. These are all factors that go into. So we really have to question the idea of whether that really is democracy. Okay? So there are different elements to this discussion. But thanks for that question. I think it drives home the point of the difference between these. All right. Now, let's move on to the post-World War II New World Order. I pointed out earlier that the international human rights law framework, as we understand it today, as the universal framework is a creation of the New World Order. Now, where does this term come from? Towards the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, who was then the President of the United States in the early 1940s, he coined this term, the New World Order. And all the other allies got on board with this vision of Franklin Roosevelt. The vision was that the New World Order should be based on 4 pillars: peace, human rights, finance, and trade. Peace, because of the events of World War II itself; human rights, because of the Holocaust and many other factors, violations of human rights. So if we have to have a new world order, we need to regulate peace and human rights at the global level, not just leave countries on their own. That was the whole idea. Finance and trade. Any ideas why finance and trade were important? Just very quickly. Yeah? After the Industrial Revolution, and one of the key factors that led to the World War II itself and amplified it was the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s. What is the Great Depression about? It was basically where countries in Europe started adopting protectionist policies. They wouldn't sell to each other, they wouldn't buy from each other. As a result, the entire global economy collapsed. And that led, many historians argue, was one of the key reasons why United States ended up joining World War II itself. It was not part of the World War II in the initial phases. It joined later. Many argue that it was the Great Depression that actually led to this. So when Franklin Roosevelt thought of creating a new world order at the end of World War II, he said, we also need finance and trade to be intrinsic pillars of this new world order. Now, you can't just have pillars, ideologically speaking, and assume that things are going to work. You need institutions to carry forward those pillars. And it's for this reason that for peace and human rights, the United Nations was established. If you look at the key institutional objectives of the United Nations in its charter, in its constitution, you will find peace and human rights are the most important objectives of the United Nations. It regulates peace and human rights around the world. In order to regulate finance, they created what we know as the Bretton Woods institutions. In other words, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These were established precisely for ensuring that the pillar of finance is regulated in the global order, in the new world order, so that we do not revert back to the same circumstances that led to the amplification of World War II. For trade, They tried to create what was supposed to be called as the International Trade Organization. This never came into force because, as generally happens, the United States leads negotiations and then change of government happens, and then the new government in the Senate blocks the ratification. We've seen that with the Paris Climate Agreement recently. Same thing happened with the International Trade Organization. US led the negotiations, change of government happened, the new Senate decided they're not going to approve the International Trade Organization. Eventually, of course, an agreement which you must have heard about, it's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT agreement, which is the agreement that regulates trade of goods around the world. That came into force, and in 1994, all of this metamorphosed into the World Trade Organization. Okay, today we have the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. The genesis of all major institutions of global governance we have today in 2018 are the creation of this vision of new world order post-World War II. What are the key institutions of global governance even today? The United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. All of them were established by the victors of World War II in 1945. Okay? So we are still with the same institutions and the structures. And it's a big debate about whether they are adequate for the problems that are emerging today. But that's a separate discussion we will have at a later point throughout the year. So, in terms of the United Nations mandate for human rights, as I pointed out, its charter, which is the Constitution of the United Nations, specifically recognizes promotion of human rights as one of its key institutional objectives. This was in 1945. However, what's interesting is that in 1945, when this was incorporated as the institutional objective of the UN, they did not have a consensus on what they meant by human rights. There was no common language of human rights existing. They incorporated it in the institutional objective, but no one agreed on what human rights meant. And it was for this reason that immediately after the UN Charter was approved, the United Nations set in motion a process for coming to a consensus on what is meant by human rights. And this was done by one of the principal organs of the United Nations, which is called the Economic and Social Council. This council set up what was called then as the Commission on Human Rights, and there were 3 tasks assigned to this commission. Number 1, to draft an international bill of human rights, which would only be declaratory in nature. In other words, it would only say that human beings are entitled to these rights. It wouldn't be legally binding on countries. It would only be a declaration. Okay? The second task would be to convert this Bill of Human Rights into a legally binding convention or a legally binding treaty that countries would sign, they would ratify, and then it would become binding on them. And the third task was that they would then draft a document for implementation of these rights. How are you going to implement these in different countries? The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which I'm sure all of you are very aware of, what we acronym to UDHR, was part of the fulfillment of this first mandate of drafting an international bill of human rights, which would be declaratory in nature. This happened in 1948. Okay? The name itself suggests that it's a declaration. It did not really confer upon human beings new rights. It only recognized the rights that are already inherent in human beings. That's why it's called a Declaration on Human Rights. It's not like states sat together and said, all right, henceforth human beings will have these rights. We agree that human beings will have these rights. They only sat down and agreed that, well, according to our traditions, according to our laws, all human beings are inherently entitled to certain rights by virtue of their very human embodiment. That is what they refer to as human rights. That is what is articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, a trivia question. World War II ended. Which war started? The Cold War started. Now, the Cold War, as you know, was about the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union at the time, and the capitalist bloc led by the United States at the time. They both had completely different ideological perspectives on governance, and this also meant that they had completely different perspectives on human rights. What human rights meant to them. Okay, so the politics of the Cold War meant that the communist bloc said, we want to deprioritize right to vote, right to freedom of speech and expression, right to freedom of movement, right to stand for public office. What we consider as important is that everyone has right to education, everyone has right to housing, everyone has right to social security, everyone has the right to health. These are what we understand as human rights, because the state has a major role to play in provision and fulfillment of these human rights to people. The capitalist bloc, on the other hand, led by United States, in terms of the capitalist ideology, basically said that the state should not intervene. The state's role is to take a step back. We should let markets rule. So human rights in our case are where state does not have to go out and provide people for food, provide people for education, provide people for housing. People should be able to do that on their own. Our role is to make sure that they can stand for public office. They have the right to vote their governments. They have the right to freedom of speech and expression. They have the right to protest. They have the right to freedom of movement. Okay? So these two differing ideologies of the capitalist and communist blocs also meant that instead of one common binding human rights treaty, the United Nations came up with two separate treaties. One is called the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which was what appealed to the capitalist bloc at the time. And the other treaty was the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Convention, which was what appealed to the communist bloc at the time. Over time, these different notions of what human rights meant have diminished to a large extent, particularly in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America. But the hangover of the Cold War still continues to a large extent, because even today, United States has not ratified, has not agreed to economic, social, and cultural rights as human rights. They call them officially as only aspirational goals. Remember Obamacare? That was what the whole debate was about. President Obama was arguing that the government has a role to play in provision of health care to the people. The Republicans were saying that's not the government's role. People should have the choice of determining what they want. The government should step back. It wasn't articulated in the language of human rights, but essentially it was about the right to health. United States, traditionally the Republican Party has been opposed to the idea of economic, social, and cultural rights being human rights, whereas the Democrats have time and again tried to ratify the convention, but they've never had a majority in the Senate or the House. So I mentioned that the hangover still continues. This is because US still today has not ratified the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Convention, and China, even today, has not ratified the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So today we know that scholars are talking about the revival of the Cold War, right? Instead of Soviet Union, now you have China and United States. A lot of those ideologies also permeate into their notions and understandings of human rights. In your seminar activity today, you will go on to discussing a lot more on these notions, because we are going to give you a TED talk by a scholar called Dambisa Moyo. She's from Zambia. And she argues that what Africa needs today is prioritization of economic, social, and cultural rights over and above civil and political rights. In one of the books that she's written, she's a very influential writer. In one of the books called Dead Aid, where she's challenged the aid policies of the West on African countries, she's gone on to the extent of saying that what Africa needs today is a benevolent dictator. So deprioritizing right to vote, right to stand for public office, but prioritizing health, education, housing, food, all of those aspects. Okay, so you'll listen to that TED talk, and this whole notion of prioritization will come back again. So so far we have discussed that there are three main documents: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Apart from these, there are 7 other human rights treaties which are called as the core human rights treaties. Together, these 10 documents are the entire corpus, the scope of what we today call as international human rights law. They're captured in these 10 documents. Okay, so these 7 others are the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, many of you are aware of that, Convention Against Torture, Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, and Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These 7 documents, along with the 3 others I've mentioned, the 2 covenants and the UDHR, these 10 documents collectively are what we refer to as international human rights law today. Yeah.
Why is the Genocide Convention from 1948 not seen as a core document? The Genocide Convention?
Yeah, because it was outside the framework of the human rights institutions of the United Nations. It weren't established at that point. The Genocide Convention, the concepts of the Genocide Convention are all incorporated in several of these treaties. Okay, the Genocide Convention was one of the first ones, you're right. But it happened at a time when the human rights discourse had not moved forward. So just to give you an example, when I mentioned these 2 conventions as the first ones, these actually came into force only in 1976. Okay? Both these covenants came into force only in 1976. So these are the first ones. They collectively called as International Bill of Human Rights today. The UDHR, these 2 covenants. And then the core human rights treaties came about around the same time or subsequently. Okay? So when we refer to as the core human rights treaties, that's what they refer to. But yeah, I mean, Genocide Convention clearly is part and parcel of the framework. So having said that, let's look at what is the official institutional perspective of the United Nations on the notion of human rights. This is what is said on the website officially. Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. These rights are all interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. The principle of universality of human rights is the cornerstone of international human rights law. In other words, this is an all-inclusive, all-encompassing, egalitarian notion of what human rights means. It's applicable to everyone, irrespective of the local context. The same ideas of human rights apply to everyone. All human beings have the same rights. However, as I've already introduced to you, this commonality, this assumption that there's something universal, there's something common about human rights, and we have all a common language of it, is not necessarily true. So, there are different perceptions on human rights because different scholars, different people, different societies have conceived of human rights in different ways. In the article by Marie Benedict Dembour that was part of your reading, she goes into the 4 schools of human rights, which articulates how people, different scholars have looked at human rights differently. And she points out these 4 categories. Some scholars romanticize the idea of human rights, that we all have them naturally because we are natural beings. Either God has given them to us or because of man's moral nature, because human being is a morally upright species. That's why we already have certain rights that are inherent in us. Some others are grounded, and these scholars say that there is nothing natural about human rights unless a group of ambassadors, diplomats sit down in a room, unless a group of legislators sit down in a room and agree to a list of rights as legal rights, they are not human rights. Okay, there's nothing natural or inherent. You need to agree upon them. Those are grounded scholars. Then there are some activists. These scholars are those who would say that human rights are not inherent at all. We actually need to constantly fight for them. They are inherently absent. We need to fight to secure them. And then there are some who are nihilists in that sense, who trash human rights as a pretension. They say this is all a pretension. This doesn't exist. It's the privilege of those who have human rights. It's an armchair intellectual exercise of those who sit in ivory towers and talk about lofty ideals of human rights and say that everyone should have them. So these are scholars who trash it as a pretension. Now, what's important is that human rights scholars do not come only from the legal field. In fact, they come from a variety of different fields. And you would have people from political science, international relations, philosophy. A lot of philosophers have written about human rights, post-colonial studies, gender studies, peace education, anthropology, sociology, economics. All of these different fields have shaped the ideas of different scholars on how they perceive human rights. Now, on the first day of your course, you had those 4 definitions of peace on the walls, right? And you were asked to walk towards the definition that that appeals to you the most. And what you noticed is that people did walk to different walls. It wasn't the case I think, in any group where everyone walked towards one particular definition. What does this mean and why is it important? Like peace, human rights also as a concept is dictated. Your perceptions are dictated by your lived experiences, by your own lived experiences or by the lived experiences of those whom you know or those who are close to you. Those experiences determine how we perceive as human, what we perceive as human rights. So some of you might have chosen the definition that peace is just the absence of war. That idea comes from lived experiences or from professional experiences where you're seen, where you empathize the fact that there are people in the world who simply aspire to live another day without being bombed. Talk to a Palestinian student, talk to someone from Afghanistan or the Kurdish region in Syria. They would basically say that, well, for us, for the time, peace is just the absence of war. We just want a day, we don't want to be bombed. Others would say that, well, we have that, and for us, we suffer from structural violence, and therefore we need to move towards sustainable development, human rights. That's what peace means to us, not just the absence of war. None of them are incorrect. All of them are correct because their own ideas, their own perceptions are dictated based on their lived experiences. It's pretty much the same idea with relation to human rights. So let's look at the 4 schools very briefly. One, as I pointed out, are natural scholars who conceive of human rights as a given. They are inherent in human beings. Then there are deliberative scholars who look at human rights as something that needs to be agreed upon. They need to be routinely secured. They're not just there, out there. We need to sit down and agree upon them. Protest scholars look at human rights as something that's completely absent, but something that can be achieved by fighting for it. We need to constantly struggle for it. And then there are discourse scholars who just look at human rights as a tool for fanciful articles, just a tool for policymakers to use to criticize each other for foreign policy interests. They're just a pretension. Okay? So, examples. This is Jack Donnelly, a political scientist, not a lawyer, who looks at human rights as something that's inherent. So this is what he says. If human rights are the rights one has simply because one is a human being, as they usually are thought to be, then they are held universally by all human beings. Human rights claims rest on a prior moral and international legal entitlement. The source of human rights is man's moral nature. Human rights are at once a utopian ideal and a realistic practice for implementing that ideal. So they are inherent in us because we are moral species. We are a moral species. And of course, there's a lot to be said about human beings assumed to be a morally upright species. But that's the idea, that we are a morally upright species. Therefore, there is something natural in rights being vested within human beings simply by virtue of our human embodiment. Some other natural scholars do not ascribe the inherence of human rights in the human being to the moral nature. They say divine is the source of human rights to human beings. But in any case, whichever approach you take, the idea is that they are natural, they are inherent in human beings. Then, the second school, deliberative school, Tom Campbell, who's written this book called Rights, A Critical Introduction. He's a lawyer, and he says this. He is one of those who says that they have to be routinely secured, they have to be agreed upon. My view is that what rights people have is a matter of social fact, though I accept that moral judgment is involved in answering the next question, what rights ought to exist. Rights as we know them are contingent historical phenomena with inherited meanings and contents rather than cultural and historical universals although this is what we may strive to make them for the future. Rights do not exist until they are routinely secured. The question to be answered is how we can best turn manifesto rights, that is what we aspire to achieve, these are manifesto rights, which express demands or proposals as to what rights ought to exist, into rights that actually do exist. So till such time that rights are actually routinely secured through agreement, they are only manifesto rights, they are only proposals. They don't really exist unless they are agreed upon by the people that need to agree upon them to make them binding. Okay? Then, we have the protest school. This is Upendra Bakshi. In his book, The Future of Human Rights, this is what he says. I take it as axiomatic that the historic mission of contemporary human rights is to give voice to human suffering, to make it visible, and to ameliorate it. Whether or not a world bursting forth with human rights norms and standards is a better world than one bereft of human rights languages still remains an open question. The originary authors of human rights are people in struggle and communities of resistance. What makes contemporary human rights movements precious is the fact that they deny all cosmological as well as terrestrial justifications for the imposition of unjustified human suffering. So what he's basically saying here is that the authors of human rights, there's nothing natural about them. They're not a group of negotiators who are the authors of human rights. The original authors of human rights are those who are in struggle, those who are fighting for it. They are the original authors of what human rights means to them. Okay? So nothing about, it's not true that a group of people just by signing on a document and saying that we agree that these are human rights, it doesn't mean that people have them. People have them because they determine that there are certain violations. They determine that those violations are violations of their human rights. They fight for it, they struggle for it, and therefore they are the ones who are constantly fighting for human rights. They are the ones who determine what human rights means, not some negotiators, not the divine. And then you have discourse school. This is the most pessimistic view of human rights. This is Makau Mutua, to whom I'll come back to in a later part of this presentation as well. He says, I wrote this book because I wanted to explain why I believe that the human rights corpus should be treated as an experimental paradigm, a work in progress, and not a final inflexible truth. It is important that the human rights movement be fully exposed so that its underbelly can be critically examined. I know that many in the human rights movement mistakenly claim to have seen a glimpse of eternity and think of the human rights corpus as a summit of human civilization, a sort of an end to human history. This view is so self-righteous and lacking in humility that it of necessity must invite probing critiques from scholars of all stripes. So very hard-hitting statements, and obviously he's talking here about the use of human rights by the global West against poor countries in the developing world, where the developing world people are basically looked at as savages, as barbarians, and the West critiques them for violations of human rights. So human rights then becomes a tool for your own foreign policy interests. So it's from that perspective he says that the whole human rights language is a neo-colonial tool. It's a tool for perpetuating neo-colonialism, and we need to fully expose its underbelly. Okay, so these are scholars from the discourse school. Now, having looked at these different perspectives, I want to briefly now go into giving you examples on how these differing perspectives and conceptions can lead to conflicts in the real world, can lead to real conflicts. Okay, so we are looking here at conceptual differences and their links with real conflicts. Now, I'll give you 3 examples on this. You will go into your discussions in the seminar with some of these. The first is the debate on whether human rights exist only when they are legislated upon or when people have access to courts for their violations. I mentioned right to water at the beginning. Right to health is another one of them. In many developed countries, right to water, right to health is not recognized as a legal right. You don't have laws that acknowledge that these are human rights. That is what we refer to as legislated. Justiciability refers to when a citizen has the ability to go to a court of law and say that my rights are being violated, can you please give me some redressal? Can you give me some solutions for the violations of my human rights? That is what we refer to as justiciability. So again, there are different perspectives on this. James Nichol, who's one of the legal scholars whom I really like personally for his very positive approach to all of this, he says, legal enforcement or justiciability of rights is not determinative of the character of the right as a human right. Okay, you don't need a particular right or a norm to be legally accepted by a government, or you don't need citizens to be able to go to courts of law for that norm to be recognized as a human right. Legality, justiciability is immaterial. Then you have Jeremy Bentham, the old philosopher from 1791, very popular book in philosophy, Anarchical Fallacies. This is what he says. Right, the substantive right, is the child of law. From real laws come real rights. From imaginary laws, from law of nature, can come only imaginary rights. Natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. So by that I imagine he means some sort of an elevated form of nonsense, right? So basically his point here is that rights can exist, human rights can exist only if there are laws. Rights, human rights are child of the law. You need the law as the parent. From then can come legal rights. So legislation, justiciability is very important for human rights to exist, according to Jeremy Bentham. Then you have Herbert Hart, who counters that by saying, well, actually human rights are not the child of law. Human rights are the parents of law. They motivate specific legislations. You need human rights. Those are the principles that exist. From them come real laws. Laws flow from human rights. It's not the other way around. Okay? So they have different perspectives on whether legislation, justiciability are important or not. And I'll give you examples of why this is important in terms of conflict. So these are the questions that arise. Do human rights exist only when they are legislated? And do human rights exist only when they are legally enforceable or justiciable before a court of law? So this is the perspective of Amartya Sen, who is one of the leading economists, a Nobel Prize winner and a philosopher. He's written this very important book, Idea of Justice, in 2009, where he basically delinks the legality aspect of rights from human rights. He says human rights are not necessarily legal rights. They are ethical claims. They are ethical claims constitutively linked with the importance of human freedom and the robustness of an argument that a particular claim can be seen as a human right has to be assessed through the scrutiny of public reasoning involving open impartiality. Therefore, he says that these are ethical claims, not necessarily legal. And he gives two examples of why he argues that legislation might sometimes even be counterproductive. Justiciability before courts might not be an option at all for something that we all understand are human rights. So think about recognizing and defending a wife's right to have an effective voice in family decisions, often denied in traditionally sexist societies. We can all agree that according to common sense, pure logic, every woman has a human right to have an effective voice in the family. But it is not a matter which is a proper subject of being legislated upon. How can you create a law which says that everyone, women and men, should have an effective voice in family decisions? How do you monitor that? How do you supervise its enforcement? It's not possible. So he gives this example to say that the assumption that legislation is the prerequisite for a norm to be a human right is fundamentally flawed. There are many norms which are human rights but are not even capable of being legislated upon. Enforcement, the right of a stammerer not to be ridiculed in public meetings. He says this is again a human right, but it is not a subject that is worthy of being enforced through courts of law. You can't, it's not going to work if in this meeting I stammer and someone laughs and I sue you before a court. It's not necessarily going to work that way. But it doesn't mean that just because I don't have the right to go to a court, it doesn't mean that I don't have the right not to be ridiculed at because I'm stammering. So the idea that Amartya Sen is bringing in here is that legality and enforcement needs to be delinked from the notion of human rights itself. Human rights are about ethical claims. James Nichol has a more straightforward approach to this. He says legal enforcement before courts is not essential for existence of norms as a human right. Legal enforceability merely makes a human right more effective. When you have the ability to go to a court of law, you only make the accountability aspect more effective, because citizens then, among all the other avenues that they have for accountability, for holding governments accountable, they have one additional avenue, which is courts of law. And therefore that brings us the question, what are the other forms of accountability if not the courts? Because there's a major assumption I think many of you are right now pondering upon. If not for courts, how else would someone claim violations of human rights? Well, historically speaking, hardly 5% or less of human rights violations are answered before courts. Most of them are answered outside of courts. State governments are held accountable outside of courts. In which ways? So, fair elections have been historically a very good way of holding governments accountable for violations of human rights. Free press has been one of the most important mechanisms. You see that all over the world. Whether you talk about the migrant crisis in Europe, whether we talk about all the things that are going in the United States, or pressure on governments such as in South Asia or in East Asia, these are all examples of where free press plays a big role. There's a very important concept in human rights advocacy which is called naming and shaming. That you name a particular government as a violator through reports, through research, through resolutions, declarations, which are not legally binding. And you try and pressurize them by shaming them. Okay, so naming and shaming is one of the most important tools in international human rights advocacy. We don't have a world court on human rights. It doesn't exist. So the United Nations system relies predominantly on naming and shaming. That's what they do. So inquiries by national human rights institutions, human rights impact assessments, reports by human rights bodies of the United Nations. None of these are courts. Yeah.
I'm just curious. I'm curious about, I know we're kind of talking about large bodies doing these things, but I feel like social media has also become a place where this is really prevalent and sometimes not accurate, or somebody who isn't actually experiencing the violation is viewing and assuming that the person who is feeling a certain way about it. But it is a very interesting phenomena that I've been paying a lot of attention to.
Absolutely. I can't agree more with you. I think social media is essentially becoming a very important tool for holding governments accountable. It's a medium at the end of the day. So Maria Teresa has done her, where is she? She's done her entire doctorate on this idea of citizen journalists in Venezuela and how they have contributed to the promotion of human rights and what are the threats they face. And of course the whole notion of fake news is part and parcel of the debate. There are threats and challenges to that, but absolutely you're right that social media is clearly a very good and important way of naming and shaming and holding governments accountable rather than courts. And then of course protests, you know, think of violent protests, non-violent protests. These have traditionally been very important ways of holding governments accountable for violations of human rights. The Arab Spring was one of the examples of this. And of course you can think of many of the violent forms of holding governments accountable for violations of human rights. You can think of protests by indigenous communities against the building of dams or factories in their areas, building of taking over of lands of poor farmers and their protests. We've seen this in many parts of the world. These are very good ways of holding governments accountable in addition to courts. So the point here being is that when courts are present, they give one more avenue in addition to all of these for citizens to then go to and hold governments accountable. But just because courts are not an option does not mean that a norm is not a human right. It still exists. To give you further example of this, many countries, as we know, do not recognize several norms, human rights norms, as legal rights through legislations and do not make them enforceable before courts. However, their non-recognition has not really stopped people from fighting for securing them violently as well as non-violently. So think of, is right to water not a human right? Just because many countries don't recognize water as a human right, doesn't mean that people who are deprived of it have not understood that as a human right. They fought for it. So some of you might be aware of the Cochabamba incident in Bolivia. In Bolivia, Cochabamba is an area where water supply was privatized to a foreign company. The foreign company, as a result of the policies or the requirements of the International Monetary Fund, the foreign private company raised the water prices to the citizens who couldn't pay for it anymore. Those who couldn't pay, their taps were shut off. And what did people do? Right to water was not legally recognized as a right. They went to the streets to protest against it. They ensured the change of the government. And now Bolivia in the United Nations, the government is one of the strongest proponents of the right to water. Okay, so that is an example of courts being absent, law being absent, but people still understanding their deprivations as violations of their human rights and using mechanisms such as protests to fight for them. In case of Cochabamba, it was violent. It turned out into a civil riot, and it ensured the toppling of the government later on as well. Think of the Arab Spring. Now, is development not a human right? Most countries do not recognize development as a human right. But many people would say that, well, we are deprived of development. The policies of the government are against our development, and therefore we need to topple them. There's scholars who have analyzed the Arab Spring as an example of people fighting against what they perceive as their development priorities being deprived. You remember the Brazilian World Cup, right? The World Cup in the Rio Olympics. During that, was it the Olympics or the World Cup recently? The Football World Cup. Yeah, there were stadiums built. As a result of the stadiums being built and the government putting in a lot of money for building those stadiums, people were asked to pay a lot more fares for public transportation. People challenged that. They went up in protests against that. Now, what are they fighting against? They are basically saying that the government's development priorities are not our development priorities. Development is a right. We have the right to determine what we think our public money should go to. They were fighting essentially against violation of the right to development. And there are many examples you can think of where development has been perceived by people as a human right, even though it is not legally recognized as such, or you can't go to a court of law. I mentioned the healthcare debate. This is a classic one. In the United States, right to health is not a human right. United States internationally has in fact rejected. It continues to be one of the countries that does not ratify the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention, which is where right to health is part of it. Okay? That's what Obamacare was all about. He tried to say that, well, the government, the state has a role to play. And the Trump administration, among the first things that they did was revoke Obamacare. Okay? So whether we think of all these are different levels of conflict. The Cochabamba civil riots, the Arab Spring, you can think of indigenous communities protesting, the people in Brazil, in Rio protesting against the hike in public fares. You can think about even more subtle levels of conflict, such as between the political levels, such as the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. These are all examples where there are norms of human rights which are not legally recognized as such, but people consider their deprivations as violations of their human rights, and I have protested against them. Okay? Then, the second example I want to give of how conceptual differences can lead to real conflicts is this notion of generations of human rights. There is a very Eurocentric perspective which comes from a Czech scholar called Karel Vasak, who in 1979 floated this notion that human rights have 3 generations. Civil and political rights are the first generation of human rights. They are the most important. Civil and political rights, right to vote, stand for public office, etc. Freedom of speech and expression. Economic, social, and cultural rights are second generation rights. And third generation rights are what are the emerging norms that they say, including right to the environment, right to peace, right to development. These are all third generation rights. Now, the question is this classification valid? This is what is taught in mainstream human rights law schools. This is the classification that's taught. But is this classification really valid? And the counter argument to this is that this segregation or compartmentalization of human rights into these generations is a reflection of its development in the European tradition. With the French Declaration, civil and political rights came first. Only later came an understanding that, well, there is something called economic, social, and cultural rights. And only then came the understanding that there are something called group rights. But indigenous communities around the world have always had communal rights to begin with. There's no idea of this is mine, this is yours. Land was owned communally in many communities, still exists. So this notion that economic, social, and cultural rights are somehow, second generation is to be challenged. And this is very important for your seminar activity as well, because there you will be looking at the debate on whether civil and political rights should be prioritized over economic, social, and cultural, or vice versa. The TED Talk is basically on Dambisa Moyo promoting the Chinese model of governance and saying that what Africa needs is a Chinese model of governance where democracy is deprioritized rather than the West going around the world trumpeting its model of democracy. Okay, so it's a very thought-provoking and unsettling sort of TED Talk, but it does make you think and gives rise to a lot of these issues we are talking about. The third example of how conceptual differences, perceptions can lead to real conflicts are the debates on universalism versus cultural relativism. We've assumed that human rights are universal. That's the official position of the United Nations. However, many cultures, many societies say that, well, our cultural understanding of this norm is different. Don't try and impose your values on us. Okay, so that's the cultural relativism argument. And there's again an entire spectrum of this. Some of those cultural relativism arguments should never be tolerated. Some others are more debatable. So this is a good snapshot of the issues that come about. So female genital mutilation. There are many societies which would say this has been a cultural practice in our community for years now, for centuries. Who are you to come and tell us that we are torturers and this is a violation of human rights? Now, this is a cultural relativism argument. Should it be tolerated? Obviously not. It is not an argument that should be accepted, that female genital mutilation should be allowed to continue. The question, however, is how do you respond in a policy way? What is the appropriate policy response to something like this? The other examples, ban on burqa or the ban on the hijab in many of the European countries. You've noticed, read about the ban on the burkini, right? So these are examples also where many Islamic feminist women scholars would argue that this actually, the burqa and the hijab, we think it's empowering. Who are you to tell us that we should not use them? Why are you fighting our cause? Let us determine what our priorities are, what we feel are our human rights, and then we go ahead with that. Okay? So again, a cultural relativism versus universalism argument. Criminalization of homosexuality is another one, where many societies have said homosexuality should not be allowed, it should be criminalized. Is it something that should be allowed under cultural relativism guise? Clearly not. Okay? The question again becomes, how do you address that situation? And then there are very tricky issues such as abortion. Okay? Many would say culturally, we do not accept abortion. Women in that community might want to say that, well, it's part of our reproductive and sexual rights. So who are you to deny that? And this is a debate which is across many different countries. So it's not something that you are unfamiliar with. Now, in terms of policy response, and this is the second last slide, I'll finish here. This is Makau Mutua. He is a scholar who was from the Discourse School, who basically says that human rights are all a pretension. Okay, so he has something very interesting to say about the use of human rights language in the specific context of female genital mutilation. Okay, and I think it's again a thought-provoking argument that he's raising here. What is the appropriate policy response? This is the general statement, and the next slide is the direct statement on FGMs. Stepping back from the current official human rights rhetoric would create a new basis for calculating human dignity and identifying ways and societal structures through which such dignity could be protected or enhanced. Such an approach would not assume ab initio that a particular cultural practice was offensive to human rights. It would respect cultural pluralism as basis for finding common universality on some issues. With regard to the practice labeled female genital mutilation in the West, for instance, such an approach would first excavate the social meaning and purposes of the practice as well as its effects, and then investigate the conflicting positions over the practice in that society, rather than being subjected to demonizing and finger pointing under the tutelage of outsiders and their local ilk. The contending positions would be carefully examined and compared to find ways of either modifying or discarding the practice, and this is the most important part, without making its practitioners hateful of their culture and of themselves. The zealotry of the current rhetoric gives no room for such a considered intracultural or intercultural dialogue and introspection. It is very important, and I'll end it here, that human rights has in the past been used to promote colonialism. And this is where this perspective comes from. The West colonized, European countries colonized the others in Africa and South Asia, etc., under the guise of quote-unquote the civilizing mission. You're barbarians, we need to come in to civilize you. So what scholars like Makao Mutua say is that the current discourse on human rights pretty much follows that same notion. It's no more colonization, it's neo-colonization. Okay? So instead of coming in and telling us we are barbarians and savages, why don't you allow us to have an organic discussion to consider intraculturally whether we need to discard the practice, instead of you coming and telling us through a UN report that you are torturers, you should be put to jail, you are barbarians, you should be hateful of your cultures, you are savages. Okay, so what policy responses ought to be appropriate is also something of deep concern. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. So the last few years I lived in Indonesia, and female genital mutilation still takes place. Although the government actually, at one point, I can't quite remember in which year it was, but it's already a few years ago, and they said, no, we can't do that anymore, it's not allowed. But then they were actually overruled by the Islamic law. So, you know, it's also sometimes that even if the government says, okay, that is not officially allowed anymore, then there's still, in certain countries, I mean, the religious law is still very present. And in this case, it's a little bit tricky as well, because now boys can, for example, they get the whole package, they can go to the hospital and they have really medical supervision and everything. And officially for the girls, it's now that they can symbolically scratch, yeah? So that's the official thing. However, and I lived in a little village, and in rural areas, it is still practice that they don't only scratch, and then it isn't performed by doctors or someone who has medical experience, and as a result, a lot of these girls do still have infections and get sick and all these things. So sometimes it is not only like maybe from the West or from someone else, it can also be inside a country a big problem.
That's a great example for driving home the point that merely laws are not necessarily going to be adequate to address issues that are so deeply culturally embedded in communities for centuries now. And that's the reason why we need to really take a step back and think about whether the correct template is to go to the community and say, these are international human rights laws. These say that FGMs amounts to a torture, which basically means that you are barbarians and you need to discard this practice immediately. You are savages. Is that likely to work? Or is consider other approach, meaning thereby going to the community, trying to generate within the community, the different stakeholders, an intra-cultural debate, a discussion on discarding the practice. We have very good examples of something like this working. The most, in many parts of the world, we have had criminalization of homosexuality, not sitting well with the perceptions of the older generations, but because of the debates that the newer generations have brought about, those practices have dwindled to a large extent in many countries. Saudi Arabia is a great example of the rights of women. Many in the past, when women were not allowed to drive cars, there would be tons and tons of reports from the West basically saying that Saudi Arabia is violating the rights of the women. How did it change? It didn't change because of these reports necessarily. It changed because of indigenous movements from feminist organizations and women within Saudi Arabia. Those are the ones who worked for changing, and that's going to be more acceptable to the regimes rather than some outsider United Nations being seen, because there's always going to be a backlash against that. So that's another example of how within a society changes are more likely to work. There's no debate that FGMs amount to torture. The question is, how do you respond to in a programmatic fashion on addressing those violations? What is likely to work better? Okay? Many times the United Nations or the NGOs make assumptions about what works in a community, and that it's not necessarily true. I give this example many times because it's a well-documented story. Not necessarily about human rights directly as such, but it drives home the point. The UNDP, in some instance, decided that they want to build wells, water wells, in Afghanistan, in Afghan towns, because women, when they go out, they walk several kilometers to the public wells, they are sexually assaulted. So to prevent that, they're going to build wells, water wells inside their homes. Women were not asked. UNDP assumed that this is the right thing to do. This is the right template to adopt. The people who protested against that were the Afghan women themselves. They said, going to the water wells is the only chance we have to socialize with other women in the city. That's the only avenue we get to know what's happening in the city or in the country. And you are blocking even that from us. So please ask us, what do we want? Right? So the point here is, what is the appropriate policy response? Can we make, my entire attempt here has been to force you to take a back seat from our preconceived notions of what is right and wrong, and to appreciate that there are different perspectives on human rights, there are different notions on what is a violation, there are different notions on what is an appropriate policy response. The victims are the most important actors. Their interests are the most important in all of these aspects. So I'm not going to get into details of this right now, but I'm pretty sure already you can start thinking about the CRC Pabio model that you looked at, the importance of the interests of the victims as key stakeholders, actors in that entire framework. Okay? If you exclude them, it's not going to work. Nothing's going to work. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just what about human dignity, actually? Like, is human dignity a justification for human right, or?
Say that again, sorry.
What about human dignity? Is it a justification, or where do we put it?
Great question. We have a colleague who just finished her PhD on the precise same topic, on human dignity as a basis for human rights, and is it or is it not? And she looked at her study from the perspective of Hannah Arendt and her work on human dignity. But yes, I mean, if I can only give you my personal view on this. Absolutely, human rights are so intertwined with the notion of human dignity that they are both, human dignity is both a basis of human rights and also its output. Unless you have human rights, there is no human dignity, and you can't even start thinking about human rights if you do not agree to the notion that human dignity is important. Okay, so it's again a two-way street. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Talking about this FGM matters.
How much time do we have? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
You're talking about that FGM matters. Well, you have told that. Well, obviously, this is a torture. Well, I'm not very much sure if this is your personal opinion. I think that can be fine. But if the international society is putting this notion, this is obviously a torture to this society, I think this is a first step to making a conflict.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. Can you repeat the last sentence?
International society is thinking that this is obviously a torture to the women, I think this is the start of the conflict. Yeah.
Sure. I think my personal opinion is it also resonates a lot with the reports of the UN bodies on women's issues. So CEDAW, which is this Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Its committee, several human rights special rapporteurs on the rights of women, have all acknowledged that female genital mutilation, we're talking about mutilation, because there are variations in the practices, that does amount to torture, if not torture, at least to what is called legally as cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Okay? The official name of that convention is Convention on Prevention of Torture, Cruel, Inhumane, and Degrading Treatment. Torture, of course, is the highest threshold of any cruelty. But then cruelty, inhumane, degrading treatment is also considered a violation of human rights. So I am absolutely convinced, because I mean, having looked at many of these issues in the past, that what we call as female genital mutilation clearly amounts to a violation, especially of young girls who do not have a voice. They don't have an option to say no. It's simply performed on them because it's a cultural tradition. So whenever free, prior, informed consent is denied, that clearly, personally for me, there are no two ways about that. When that is denied, it clearly does amount to a violation of human rights. If someone voluntarily wants to do it, fair enough. There can be no debate that it's not torture. Torture comes in when it's done forcibly, when there is coercion, when there's an absence of consent. That's when torture or cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment comes about. In many cultures, that becomes a very subtle form, because sometimes women might say yes. In fact, in many cases, mothers and grandmothers are the ones who would force their daughters to undergo the practice. And that's because they have internalized the norm and rationalized the norm that FGMs is the right cultural practice to do. Because we all live in traditionally patriarchal and sexist societies. So we've internalized those norms that this is the right thing to do. Does not necessarily mean that it is the right thing to do, but in the absence of consent, it becomes more grave, it becomes more obvious. Yeah? And as I said, in case of female genital cutting, there are different variations, there are different forms of doing that. Some are clearly more aggravated forms than others, and their consent also comes into play. Yeah? Okay, we have time for one more question,
We have analyzed all the aspects of the wrong way of going into a country, and of course saying this is right, this is wrong. And culture most of the time is the justification of saying I'm doing this because it's my culture. But we need to consider most of these countries are male dominated, so the culture has been mainly dictated by male or elders who decide for everyone. And on top of that, how can you consider a choice when you cannot even rely on the consciousness of awareness? I mean, no girl of 3 years old or 5 years old can be aware or conscious of what is going on. So you cannot say that this is actually culture accepted, this is forced, so this is actually torture. And on top of that, if we need to wait for the culture to change from the inside, how many centuries we need to wait for it? I mean, how many more, especially women, have still to suffer all kind of discrimination because we need to wait for the culture to change. So I'm actually from a little bit more law side. I mean, I really do believe that law needs to be enforced no matter what. And then it will come probably a change. We cannot wait for the culture to change. Otherwise, we wait another 2,000 years maybe to see a little improvement on some aspects of our lives.
I think you are again very right there. I think the point that Makao Mutua is making again is that you need to have a cultural, intra-cultural dialogue there. But you are absolutely right that in cases such as this, you're going to have a lot of time passed before real cultural changes on the ground are taken. And therefore, when I gave the presentation, I think it's very important to highlight that laws by themselves are not going to be adequate. You need the other elements to be part and parcel of the whole process. However, it does not mean that you can work without laws as well. They both need to be present. Without that, you will not work. So, and this is again the key question with relation to other aspects such as use of force in international relations. When I do the session on that, I'll explain the importance of international laws. Are we better off in a world without international laws that prohibit use of force, or are we better in a world with laws that prohibit use of force? Violations will take place, but that doesn't mean that we can go back to the law of the jungle. Simple example, homicides take place in almost every country, but there are laws that prohibit murder. Does it mean that just because there are homicides, the law prohibiting murder is useless? Clearly not. The law is very important, because then you can have ways of holding accountability. The discussion goes through is at a higher threshold of what is legal, what is illegal. You're not starting off from a base where everything is allowed and no one is accountable for anything. So laws are clearly important, even if there are violations. We need to work on the effectiveness. At the same time, merely having laws is hardly ever going to work. In India, where many of you, for instance, are aware of gang rapes, right? There have been many such instances of gang rapes which have been publicized, there have been protests. India is a deeply patriarchal nation. It's not just one nation, many nations, deeply patriarchal. Our laws that, and there was this whole movement for sentencing perpetrators of gang rape to death. Is that likely to stop it? Is making capital punishment for rapists is it like when you have that on the law, the problem of gang rapes in India are going to solve? No. I mean, it's a culture of treating women as trash. That culture needs to be addressed. Unless that is done, laws by themselves are not going to be adequate. But does it mean that laws should not be there? I don't know. I think laws all obviously have to be there as well. Okay? Final question. Yeah.
I want to ask if there are any alternate sources of emancipation apart from the human rights. I got this out from the reading. If there's an alternate source of,
if there are organized sources, alternative sources of emancipation. Yeah, I mean, human rights are one of the very important tools for emancipation because they articulate what otherwise human security and human development misses out on, which is the language of rights and duties. When you use a human security framework, you don't articulate the denials as my right and your duties. That's what human rights brings in. So it's a very strong, potent advocacy tool, not just before courts. I mean, most NGOs don't conduct advocacy before courts. They work, they lobby using these languages. But that doesn't mean that there are no alternative tools for emancipation. Human security, human development, actual work on the ground, these are all very important tools as well. Conflict transformation in the broader sense, apart from resolution. I mean, I think you've gone through those terms. If not, you will in the intervention sessions. Conflict transformation seeks to address all these underlying problems. Think of even poverty. Addressing, alleviating poverty may not be a subject that is appropriate for the human rights language, right? Addressing poverty as one of the key reasons for conflicts to emerge may need a different policy response, may need a different tool for emancipation rather than just the language of human rights. And it will. In my opinion, poverty is something, it's helpful to articulate poverty in human rights terms, but it's clearly not something that can resolve the issues of poverty. You need other tools. Okay, very, very last.
I assume that all these cultural practices must come from somewhere. They don't just appear and say, okay, today we do female morality, what's the name? FGM. I assume that there must be needs behind that. That's why they have been established. For example, the Eskimos, they did, how it's called, infanticide. But behind that, there is a reason why they do so. From outside, it might seem very cruel. But from the inside, there's a need behind. So I was thinking that the only way to change this is to develop an alternative which addresses exactly these needs, so they are not forced anymore to do the practice.
Great. I think that's a great starting point for interventions in the next week, when you look at how can you step in to address these underlying interests that seem to be seemingly conflicting with each other. How can you intervene in those to address those and find alternatives for what seem to be intractable problems, irresolvable problems. Okay, so great. So thank you all, and I wish you all a very good seminar.